the most impact that COVID had was being an accelerator of the concept of working from home for Israel. The less structured the interview is, the more you give certain biases more a chance to sneak in unchecked. Learn to cut interviews short. If it's a no-go, it's a no-go. People need to be better, not only at hiring, but also at knowing when to fire soon. They don't know how to Google things. They don't know how to use Stack Overflow. And this is a huge problem. What ChatGPT tries to do is give the most plausible sounding answer.
What you think the biggest challenges are right now in attracting talent to your roles in Israel? And have you found any strategies that are especially important or relevant in the Israeli market compared to other countries, perhaps?
Okay, so the Israeli market, I think, is a good reflection of the global market in many ways, in the sense that we were having a lot of layoffs here, especially in high tech, around, coronavirus times, 2022, and then the war in Ukraine. And generally speaking, a lot of investors pulled out in a sense, which caused a lot of layoffs. And then those layoffs caused kind of a culture of layoffs within companies. Without talking about that a lot, the interesting thing about Israel is two things, I think, what makes Israel unique. One, we're currently, without expanding too much on the subject, we're in the middle of a war. So the war is kind of just another wedge in the economy, as a kind of a continuation of recent global events, which causes even more layoffs, more instability, less investment. Although I will say that investors that are used to investing in Israel are continuing, so that kind of saves some of it. So interestingly, investors kind of moved from a mentality of investing in growth to a mentality of investing in profitability. Also, employees moved from a mentality of finding the highest salary to a mentality of finding stability, in a sense. So lately, I've been seeing more and more employees asking in the initial interviews, which is new to me, some questions along the lines of, is the company stable? Did you have layoffs recently? So these are very, very interesting shifts. And I think you can kind of attract talent by showcasing stability as a company, and you need to think how you can do that. And additionally, something unique about Israel, I mean, if I'll just talk about the Israeli market in general, is that this might be a global trend, I'm not sure, but we're getting more and more non-academically oriented. Candidates, which means that they either did boot camps to learn a certain profession and then maybe some kind of experience. It really depends if you're hiring a senior employee or a junior one. And this is very new to me personally, I'm getting more and more people that just get released. Army in Israel is mandatory without going into the war and whatever. It's always been mandatory, right? Even in peace times. And I'm getting more and more people just getting released from their kind of mandatory term. And they are doing high-tech relevant positions in the military, which is very new to me. And they know how to phrase, and their positions are kind of also within the military are spoken of as high-tech positions, right? So this is kind of the Army's way of trying to become more advanced. So I get more people now coming into interviews saying, look, I'm going to be released from the military in a few months, and I'm a product analyst, in the Army or something along those lines. And this poses a big challenge actually for me, because it's already hard enough. I'm from an academic background, which is my bias in a sense. It's easier for me to get along and understand people that come from the academy because I know what they've been through. I know kind of the different, it's more of a holistic approach of knowledge. Um, and then it's hard enough for me to understand what people that went to boot camps know or don't know. People coming from the military, it's a huge challenge. I mean, they're dealing, sometimes they're not even capable of speaking about what they did. So you start kind of this conversation about different skill set and you're trying to understand. I'm kind of answering several questions here, I feel, at the same time. But as a company, if I'm trying to attract someone, I think the biggest thing, the biggest differentiator, I think right now is stability and options. I feel like we can get away much more with salary than we used to be able. And also, it's important to say that Israel is very is sensitive to where geographically the company is. So if you're in the center of Israel, the salaries are much higher and also real estate is much higher, etc. If you're more in the periphery, which is the case with my company, our main offices are in the south area of Israel, you can get a lot more with kind of lowering salaries or doing lower salary and promising kind of growth, etc. So that's, I think, kind of my best way of answering about how to attract, and then how to assess is a totally different story.
That's a great analysis of the market. Um, One thing that struck me as you were discussing that was I was just trying to think about like the labor pool. So, and trying to compare it to a country like Australia. So in Australia, I haven't done the analysis, but I would have thought probably the majority of people who work in tech and data would be from overseas, and they've come here as a student and gotten a skilled visa, or they've come on a skilled visa migration program. And so we had this strange period throughout COVID where we had complete lockdown and no migration at all for 2 years. We had very unusual situations where there was basically 0% unemployment in the market, massive increase in salaries. And now we've kind of seen a return to normalcy since we've had more migrants come in to address that balance. What about in Israel? Are most of the workers in Israel in tech Israeli, or are they coming from other countries?
So I don't have statistics about this. It's important to say that I'm giving my personal experience here, but my experience is that the vast majority of tech employees in Israel, and I mean not outsourced, right? So internal programmers, analytics, data scientists, not salespeople, not customer support, etc. The vast majority are Israeli. I think by a large margin. And so COVID in that sense had less impact. The most impact that COVID had was being an accelerator of the concept of working from home for Israel. And I do think that it pushed some companies to go into outsourcing certain aspects of the company, but obviously not kind of the main competency of the company, which is usually R&D in tech. So R&D is I would say 99% Israeli in Israel. We don't have a lot of migration. And I think that makes sense because most people that decide to migrate to Israel, they're not doing it for work.
It's for cultural reasons, I guess.
For cultural reasons, main cases that I've seen, people actually, going into Israel to. So the exception is that I do know that some people migrate to learn in Israel. I do know that there are some programs in the academy that accept a lot of people from abroad, but I don't think there's a lot of them in the work market. I think most people that work in the Israeli market are people that, for cultural reasons, for religious reasons, for any kind of reasons, they decided to do what in Israel is called to make aliyah, which is essentially to move permanently to Israel, become an Israeli.
You mentioned earlier a really interesting problem I'd never thought about, which is when you're interviewing candidates who've come from a work environment that's inherently secretive, where they can't really divulge the details of what they've done. How do you go about evaluating their skills and their experience in an interview in that kind of environment?
It's difficult. I've actually encountered it mainly in the last few recruitment rounds, and I'm still figuring it out myself, honestly, because on one hand, I do like to build a structured interview. I think it's very important that you do the same, mostly like 80-90% the same interview to all candidates. Otherwise, I feel it becomes very hard to compare. So the interview itself and the assessment of skills outside of talking about what they did is the same, which is a good thing. But talking about what they did and their experience and what they know how to do is very hard. So I just become much more reliant on knowledge questions and assessment than I do understanding past projects right now. I am trying to figure out a better way to do it because I don't want to address them as people that don't have work experience, which is kind of what happens when you don't understand what they did. I think it's a little bit unfair, but the the army itself, which is most of the cases where they cannot really divulge what they did not find a good solution for this. I think the military is kind of still getting used of seeing itself as an employer of tech workers in this sense. So I think it's going to take some time, even culturally, for Israelis and Israel to get to a point where we're able to hear about a certain role, because there are very specific, you're in a certain unit, in a certain part of the army, and any Israeli kind of knows what that means. If you're in intelligence, it's a different story than if you're in the Navy, right? It's not kind of hard to understand. So that gives you a good grasp. But inside, right now, the big mess is that most of these roles are inside intelligence, and most of them don't have anything to do with intelligence. So you could be kind of helping other units in the military develop their BI or something. And it's very hard to understand what that means, especially because the situation in the Israeli army in terms of systems, so information systems, it's a honestly, personally, I would say my personal experience is that it's a big mess. Each unit has something different. It's a huge organization. It's very important.
Just like any other bureaucracy in a sense.
Exactly, exactly. Any huge bureaucracy, it becomes very complicated, very inefficient in this sense. So also the people that work in these environments, they struggle a lot. A lot of their experience is struggling with inefficiency in a huge organization, which I assume might be relevant for certain companies, but not for me personally. So they can talk a lot about that, but it's not so interesting to me.
You touched on something earlier. You mentioned for your interviews in general, you like to follow a more structured approach because you found it easier to compare candidates. I feel like this is worth unpacking a bit because I see a lot of companies still do a very ad hoc kind of approach. And so I'd be interested to hear more about why you do structured interviews, what that really means, and how you feel it's better than an unstructured approach in some cases.
Yeah, it is important to say that I have some history in recruitment, specifically just to give you in one or two sentences. I was a recruiter in the military, so I was responsible of interviewing people that are going to be recruited in the future, and determining whether or not they're fit for certain roles. And this was a non-technical interview. It was a personality, you could say, interview in a sense. And I've learned a lot about interviewing from that period of time. I did a 4 months course in the military about how to interview people. So I have some past in that regard. Of course, a natural transition for me. I worked in a big recruitment company after I finished the military. And at some point, I realized that I'm much more attracted to the technical aspects. And I've ended up learning industrial engineering with data science as the main thing. But I still have that background, right? In some area. And I think, structural interview, that having a structured interview is extremely important. I feel that the ad hoc approach just allows you to sneak in so much more bias without noticing. I mean, I think, bias is not something that you need to run away completely from. I think having a good feel if this is someone you'd like to work with or not is important. It's not like bias. Bias is a very negative kind of word, right? But I also pull into that just feeling whether or not this is the kind of person that you would be have a good time working with, which is a good thing. But I feel that the less structured the interview is, the more you give certain biases more a chance to sneak in unchecked. Let's call it like that. So you might have had a bad morning or a good morning, or the coffee machine didn't work, or the person going into the interview was a little bit tired or stressed or whatever. So that will just take a much bigger chunk of your judgment, and you would not know to say that that's what caused you to decide these things. So I think the important part is to understand why you think what you think about the candidate, right? So it's okay if you say, I don't like that candidate because I think I would not have a good time working with him. But you need to be able to say in the same breath that he's pretty good technically, right? If you just have this vague idea that this guy is not good for the company, I think you might be missing a good reason of why maybe he is the best candidate if you do need to recruit right now. So structured interview gives you a much better way to keep yourself in check, a much better way to compare candidates to each other. I do think you need to keep it semi-structured in the sense that you should not be robotic, right? If a candidate says something interesting that's unique to that candidate, you should do a follow-up question. You should try to understand that person specifically. So you should not avoid having uniqueness in an interview, but having a skeleton, right, of an interview, I think is crucial. I personally really don't like people that freestyle and then just kind of give you the halo effect of how they felt in an interview. And I will say that while I like a structured interview, I do like questions that are built into the interview, that they are part of the structure, but they're not really structured within themselves. So I like logic questions. I like to combine, let's talk about an analyst, for example. So I will ask some SQL questions, right, which are completely structured. There is kind of a right answer, right? Although I will say that even in SQL questions, there are many aspects that I'm looking at apart from whether the output is correct or not. So I like to look about how the person organizes the code. I like to look at how much time it took to get to that answer. I like to look at how the person addresses the problem. So personally, when I'm writing an interview, and this is also important, I write every part of the interview before I start a round. I mean, I have a document with all the questions that I want to ask, and each question, I have a set of parameters that I want to measure, let's call it. And I also like to take it one step further, and I like to define a scoring mechanism for each parameter. And all of these things exist to safeguard from essentially, in a big sense, bias. But really, the bottom line is that I'm trying to make as much as possible objective decisions. It's impossible to make it completely objective, but if I have very focused, very well-defined parameters that I'm scoring, and I feel that Boolean scoring is very good in this sense, because if you're saying, okay, did this guy in the sequel was organized or not? And you say yes or no. And then you have like 5 parameters and you go yes or no. The thing that solves, and I found personally, from experience, is that if I'm giving like a 1 to 10 score, I find myself going back after 5 interviews, really wanting to change the scores of the past candidates, simply because I'm still calibrating, right? I might have my own concept of what's good or not good. And then I have like 3 or 4, and I realize, the test that I've done is much harder probably than what I thought it was. And I was much harder on these first candidates than on these last candidates because I kind of calibrated a little bit. And I feel that that's okay if you're aware that you need some calibration within a few interviews. But if you try to keep the parameters and the scoring mechanism really simple, really on point, you need less of that. So what I was initially saying was that I do have SQL questions, etc., but I also really love logic questions. So I can give you 2 questions from my last round of interviews that I think are good examples. So one type of the question was popularized in Israel by an app attribution company. And I've kind of, before I do an interview, I ask around people that are friends or colleagues or past colleagues, try to understand what are the questions that are being asked in the market. And a question that I heard a lot for analysts in Israel goes like this. It's a nice question. So they ask, how many apps do you think a person has on their phone on average? Now, this is a highly vague question, right? It's the sort of question it's the category of questions. I would put it in the same category as are there more toilets or humans, right? These type of questions, which I personally like. And I think that one is particularly brilliant because it's very easy to define well statistical moments for that question, because you cannot have 0 apps on average because phones come with apps. And you cannot have an infinite amount of apps because there is a certain amount of storage. So you can talk about distribution, about minimums, maximums, medians versus averages. So I think that's really nice to do. But the important bit for me is that when you give a question that doesn't have one right answer, there's like right directions of thinking about it and knowing kind of statistics a little bit to be able to talk about things statistically, but you still need, as the interviewer, to define very well defined goals of what you expect in order to score. So in that regard, I won't have, did the person got the right answer? So I would say things like, did the person know by himself to speak in a statistical way, or did he just, I had a candidate. This is I do anecdotes, but I had a candidate in the last round that I asked a variation of this question. I didn't want to ask this specific question because it was very popular at the time in Israel. So I asked, how many furniture are on average in a room? It's kind of the same story. And I had this one candidate that just started looking at the rooms around us and counting furniture, right? So this is a good example of someone not kind of trying to look at the big picture, trying to think about which types of rooms exist in the world, right? In these different types of rooms, what type of furniture could you find? So kind of abstracting this idea. So you could, for example, say, did the person think abstractly about the question, or was he highly influenced by the surrounding environment, for example? So these are really measurable scoring systems for a very vague question. Did the candidate know to say that the average must be higher than the median, right? So these are things that I'm able to score objectively, even though there's no right answer.
That is a outstanding description of structured interviews and such a clear process that you have. There's so many things I want to pick into. One is you mentioned here, so you got to have almost like this expectation over what a good answer would be, checking off, did the candidate mention this or go in this direction? What I found quite difficult in the past is if it's a brand new question that I've never asked anyone, I almost have no idea what candidates are going to say. And so it's not until I've interviewed several of them that I start to notice the patterns. And it's almost like I can only get my criteria after 5 interviews. Have you experienced that? And if so, any ideas of how to solve that?
Yeah. I've experienced it. It's a little bit similar to what I've mentioned about the calibration. So it's not only the scoring, calibrating who's good or bad. It's also calibrating the scoring mechanism itself, you could say. So I've definitely encountered that. And in the recent round of interviews, this is an interesting, actually, use case of this, example of this. So I've went ahead. I've tried to be kind of creative, right? I like to try and be a little bit creative when I can. And I've decided to ask about the subject of statistical bias. And there is a very famous case of statistical bias called survivorship bias. And just for anyone hearing that is not aware of this, is the case. I mean, there's a very famous case in the World War II where the Allies sent planes to fight Axis planes, and a lot of people lost their lives in these kind of airplane fights. And those that returned to base, they wanted to understand how can they strengthen those airplanes to survive better those fights. So they started marking where they find hits on the plane. So bullet holes, right? And then they've diagrammed all the hits, and they went to the analyst of the army. They showed him all the hits and said, okay, where should we focus on increasing armor, right? And the survivorship bias here is that most people tend to say, look, I see a big chunk of hits in this area, right? There's a highly dense area of hits. So we should focus on that because people are used to say, where I see more data, this is a more important area, right? It's a bias. It's a classic bias. And actually, in this case, you really need to think critically about how data is collected and understand that you can only collect data from airplanes that actually returned to base. And so the relationship between survivorship and density of hits is actually reversed, because where you have blank areas, the chances of getting hit there and surviving are actually the worst. And the less dense the area, the less likely you are to survive a hit there. And it's very hard. And so what I did in the last round of interviews, I kind of counted on people not having this general knowledge. And generally speaking, I was correct. I mean, only 1 or 2 candidates out of around 20 actually knew about this. So what I did in the interview, I just showed this image, right? There's this famous image on Wikipedia of the plane with the markings of the hits. And I showed them this image and I told them the story that I just told here. And I said, okay, so you're the USA analyst and you need to tell me where to strengthen the airplane. And I just wanted to see where it goes and whether or not they figure out. And the interesting part was I had a very good follow-up question to this. So after they figured out that you need to strengthen the less dense areas of if you think about it like a scatter plot. So you need to strengthen the areas where there's no dots, right? My follow-up question, which I really liked, was how do you feel survivorship bias could happen in app analytics? Because we're an app company, right? So I wanted to see whether they're able to kind of extrapolate their knowledge and understanding of the problem to the domain. Um, and what happened was that in the first initial interviews, when they didn't figure it out at all, right? I gave a few, um, hints if they were completely wrong about it. But in the first few interviews, I did not force them to understand the issue at hand, right? If they didn't know, they didn't understand it, I was fine with it. I moved on. But then a few of them did figure it out, and I understood that the next follow-up question is very important to me. And so I started in the later interviews. If they didn't figure it out completely, at some point I tried to gently push them in the right direction until they did figure it out. So I did mark in my mind that they needed my help to get there, but I did want to ask the follow-up question. And in order to ask the follow-up question, I needed them to understand what survivorship bias is. And so that maybe made me a little bit unfair towards these initial first interviews where I didn't do that. So I don't know if that's a great example, but that's kind of what I thought about when you've asked. And this is a change of the interview itself, right? In a sense, after calibrating and understand what kind of answers I should expect from the candidates, do I have a way to not make this too burdensome on the interviews? I think the only way maybe is to rely on benchmarked questions. So either you have a track record of questions that you've asked before, you're doing this for a long time. You've asked, there's a bunch of questions that are your favorite questions. You already know what people know or don't know. That's one way. Or if you don't have that experience, you could rely on speaking to other recruiters. Maybe you have some friends, maybe you have some friends that have in their companies people that recruit data positions and they don't mind talking to you a little bit. So you could kind of try to rely on others' experience to try to build something with a benchmark already built in. Personally, I will say that this is, in a sense, good practice, but I will probably always try to test one or two new questions each round, simply because I feel that also as someone who recruits people, I need to find ways for me not to burn out, in a sense. So this is kind of my fun, right? Thinking about creative new questions that I didn't encounter and kind of play testing them.
Another approach to like the lack of data at the start, the sort of empty restaurant problem might be asking some of your team. Like if you have a few current analysts in the team, you could almost maybe ask them and get almost be a starting point for some reasonable answers. Thinking about it now, maybe a large language model. If you just asked ChatGPT and Claude 5 or 10 times, it might be like a few ideas and you can start to get an imagination of what candidates might actually reply with.
Yeah, so that's a very good, ChatGPT is a very interesting subject. And interestingly, one of the ways that I found myself kind of trying to combat the era of ChatGPT in recruitment, because I feel that it's a very important tool. And personally, I feel that people that know how to utilize different AI tools are better employees. They're better at doing their job. But there's a catch, because I've encountered many people that are kind of one-trick ponies. So any problem that they have, they throw it, ChatGPT or Claude or whatever your favorite LLM is. And if they are not able to solve the problem that way, they just get lost. They don't know how to Google things. They don't know how to use Stack Overflow. And this is a huge problem.
I'm interested in that. Sorry, just to interject for a second. These tools are so new. You're basically saying to me that you already know people who, I don't want to say addicted to them, but rely on them completely to do their jobs. Are these fresh graduates who've almost never used, like they're almost AI natives? Or are you also noticing people have almost lost some experience of using tools they used to use?
Yeah, so both. I feel that on the people that are just now finishing, their degree or just entering the market in a sense. It's very clearly starting to be the case. I've met more than I'd like people that are like that. And then also I see this is less, I mean, I didn't interview for a senior position for a while, so I cannot say about that specifically about ChatGPT. I should be able to say soon, but my colleagues, I see that on them, right? So some of the people in R&D on our company, you can see that, the first thing they do is ChatGPT, and then they might come to me or to the CTO or whatever when they can find a solution. And we ask them, did you check Stack Overflow? And they're like, no. Okay, so why did you come to me at this point? So definitely I see people becoming more lazy. And I definitely see people just entering the market feeling like ChatGPT is the savior and it will solve all their problems. And this is a huge problem. And one of the ways that I've kind of changed how I do interviews in the ChatGPT era, let's call it, is that when I build questions, especially if these are questions that I'm going to give as a home assignment, I try to build it in a way that when I give it to Claude or ChatGPT, they give an incomplete answer. And in order for them to give a complete answer, you need to push them in the right direction. So I might start with a first draft, ask ChatGPT to solve it, see kind of how he tries to answer it, and then ad hoc try to insert something that would trick him. And I use that as the home assignment. And that really allows me to try a little bit and catch those that exclusively use ChatGPT, especially if it's an analytics. I give some data and I ask them to kind of analyze it or whatever. I usually like to insert some big mistake in the data, but not big enough for ChatGPT to understand it's a big missing chunk or an outlier, just something a little bit strange that's not a pattern.
The sort of things that a well-trained analyst should pick up, but that for AI, for whatever reason, is impossibly difficult.
Yeah, because an AI does right now what you ask him to do. And I rely a little bit on psychology here when I assume that they're just going to copy the question that I ask and insert that into ChatGPT. So I specifically ask that question as to not point the AI in the direction of finding anomalies in the data, for example, and then he won't do that. So if the person is a little bit smarter than that, he rephrases the question, he looks at the data by himself first, or anything, he could avoid that. But I do try to keep a minimum guard against people to just throw the issue at ChatGPT.
It's really interesting what you've observed, because it sounds like, so for the people who aren't, let's say, AI natives, like the really young people who've just adopted this tool part of the end of the university, now they're working. So the people who are a little bit older and can remember 2 years ago when this didn't exist, and they've already had a profound change in their mindset and their behavior and their habits, that now their first point of call is ChatGPT. That's quite interesting, and probably on average better for them. I feel like for myself, if anything, I've had the opposite bias where I should use it more. And it's my lack of patience every time I use it, where I'm like, oh, I need to keep prompting. And eventually I'm like, oh, it's too difficult. I'll just do it manually. So I feel like the people who've made the full switch, maybe they've made it slightly too early, but it's still going to be ultimately to their benefit, I suspect. But as long as they still remember their other tool set, they can't just use the hammer for everything.
Exactly. So that's the problem. So I completely agree with you, by the way. So I'm interesting. I don't know if this is actually related, but I'm trained as a machine learning engineer. So I understand the kind of the bits and bolts of how ChatGPT works, but still I use it less than some of these new candidates. I like to think about myself just getting a little bit old in a sense, and making it hard a little bit to learn new tricks. So I'm completely with you. I should be using it more than I do. But the main problem with these kind of candidates and people that really got addicted, in a sense, to using it are if they either never learned any other approach to solving issues or they forgot that there are other approaches. And I see that happening, unfortunately, faster than I would assume. I don't think ChatGPT, I mean, it's a very impressive tool. Don't get me wrong. Very impressive. If you know how to use it, it can be a huge time saver. But it's not, you should take anything that you do with ChatGPT with a little bit of grain of salt still. And a lot of people don't seem to understand that. They don't seem to understand that ChatGPT has, people use it and they feel like it's the same as a Google search, which is very much a mistake.
Yeah, I feel like the challenge with ChatGPT is that if you ask it something about a topic that you're not an expert in, you will never be in a position to really critically understand its answer. And as a first pass, it's like, oh, wow, this sounds great. But if it's a topic that you know a lot in and you start to really dig into it and you're like, hang on, you missed this, this is bullshit, this is a lie, this is, a misrepresentation. You really have to almost be an expert in the area to be able to validate its output.
And honestly, I think the only way you should use ChatGPT is where you're an expert. So what ChatGPT, where it excels in my mind, is where you are able to save time, but by giving it kind of the dirty work. So you're trying to write maybe some function or whatever, and you know how that function should look like, but I don't know, you need to do like a configuration file, a huge JSON or YAML file or whatever with a bunch of parameters, and it's going to take you some time to write it. That's where ChatGPT excels, right? Where it can help you really write that file and you can validate it. It's much faster. So that's exactly where you should use it. Or maybe you're trying to explain something to someone that you know how to explain it, but you're trying to simplify, but you can validate what ChatGPT does. And unfortunately, I see a huge trend of people doing the opposite, right? Trying to use ChatGPT for exactly for the things that they are not able to validate. And this just creates, the better ChatGPT becomes, the less of a problem this becomes, but it's still a huge problem. People, ChatGPT, people don't understand that what ChatGPT tries to do is give the most plausible sounding answer, right? And that's a very tricky thing. I personally think that even though it's kind of a way of limiting how you use ChatGPT, it's definitely something you should use only for areas that you have enough basic knowledge in.
So it's very good at kind of convincingly lying and seeming shiny and correct. It's almost like the world's biggest psychopath or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Because I like to think of ChatGPT and Claude and all these LLMs like the guy that answers the most nice sounding answer in a forum, right? And this doesn't necessarily mean that it's correct. It's just the nicest sounding answer. So it always sounds really good. It always sounds logically correct. So it's very coherent, but it could be totally, totally wrong. So people not validating ChatGPT, people just blindly trusting it, which is becoming more and more the case. Also for data-oriented people, which should be, I feel, more inclined towards critical thinking and trying to question the underlying, how was this data collected, what's happening in the data. And still, these people also, they just push things at ChatGPT, they get some insights and they feel like, ChatGPT has spoken.
That's our new god, basically.
Exactly. Our new deity.
So let me ask you this. So you've worked without a formal talent acquisition team to do recruitment yourself, obviously leveraging the experience you had already in your career as a recruiter. So that's helped you a lot. What advice would you give to someone in, let's say, a smaller company, maybe a startup, a scale up, who has to build out their own team without a talent team in place to help them? Is there any kind of approach you'd recommend them taking? I guess you've already talked about the structured interview approach and trying to measure things there, but any other suggestions you can make?
Yeah, unfortunately, the biggest suggestion that I'm going to make is free up a lot of your time. It's going to be a hard, long process. And because you don't have anyone to really do some kind of an initial, filtering for you, you're going to have to do that somewhat yourself. And what we do in the company is we try to delegate this process each time to a different uh, manager, right? So in the company, we're kind of like three managers. There's me, there's the CTO, and then there's the CEO. And we do the recruiting mostly ourselves. So when it's a hardcore programmer role, I'll do the initial filtering and then the CTO will do the technical interview. When it's an analyst, I might let the CEO or the CTO do the initial filtering, just a phone call, 10 minutes phone call or something like that. And then I'll do the technical interview. And the goal here is not so much as to, I mean, there are two benefits of this. One, I do think it's very good to make a candidate go through at least one more manager in the company apart from yourself during the process, because you might have a very big bias in terms of what you like to work with. But another person might really balance you out saying, look, yeah, I realize he's very much your type, but you should pay attention to X, Y, and Z. So I feel that if you don't have a talent acquisition, do try to pull a manager that you trust, even if he's not kind of your type of role, right? Even if you're very different in terms of role, and make him kind of the HR, because any of us can, better or worse, can try to just talk to someone, understand, is he an okay person? Should I let him do the technical interview? So I do think there's art in that as well. I'm not saying HR, they have very important skill set in that regard, but I do think if you don't have an HR, you should sit down with a different kind of person other than yourself that you trust, kind of explain what you're looking for and let them do it. You should not do the screening and the technical interview. So that's one thing that I would say. And you should talk to that person or make him write a rather verbose summary of what he thought about that interviewee. And then, again, clear out a lot of time, because I feel that it's hard to screen in the initial interview, which means that you're going to do a lot of technical interviews, and that's life. And my last recommendation is, I see that a lot of interviewers have the tendency of really, they force the entire interview. And sometimes you ask the first question, maybe the second question, and you already realize it's not going anywhere, right? This is not what you're looking for. So I think it's a very important skill to know how to elegantly stop an interview early on without the interviewee feeling, if you're into not making the interviewee feeling like he's not good, which personally I don't like to do. I like to finish every question with the interviewee, the candidate, feeling that perhaps they had some good things in their answer, even if they didn't have anything. I don't like to finish a question and move to the next question if the answer is, I don't know. I try to force them into some type of answer, just because I personally don't like to feel like I'm leaving them feeling like they're truly, they don't know anything. Although if they started their answer with, I don't know, they're already in a bad position. But I want them to try and see what they can come up with. And I also don't like to move to the next question. But you need to learn to finish a question elegantly, maybe ask like some final questions like, what kind of expectations do you have from us? Do you have any question about the company, which makes the interviewee feel like there is kind of a natural closure of the interview? But learn to cut interviews short. If it's a no-go, it's a no-go.
Yeah, there's no point wasting each other's time, especially as you said, you can exit it elegantly. That's a great list of suggestions. One I would add to that, like based on our conversation and the other people I speak to over the years, I feel like your approach to hiring is extremely well thought out. I wouldn't say necessarily structured, just like you put a lot of thought into each detail. And I feel like it's that planning that sets you up for success once you're actually doing it. And I feel like a lot of companies might kind of jump into hiring, like, oh, we need to hire this engineer quick. Let's whack up a job ad and start doing something. It's just this chaotic process that inevitably fails more often than it should. But it's clear if you have this really structured plan of what you're looking for, what your questions are, what the answer to the question is going to be, you've kind of planned out the whole process in a way that maybe you might have to have enough patience to do. You might have to carve it out enough time. And to your point, expect that it's going to take a lot of time. Like we need to like reframe our expectations that hiring is very important. It is going to take some time. Yes, once you go as quickly as possible, but with a really solid plan, you can execute and be more successful.
I will say, by the way, as a last touch, that everything that I said is important. I feel you need to interview thoughtfully. You need to think about. You need to plan. But hiring is very complicated. It's very hard to really know, even if you do several interviews. And I try not to do it too complicated, too many steps process. I feel that the candidate gets burnt out, you get burnt out. I'm not really in favor of doing more than 2 or max 3 steps in a recruitment. But I will say it's often impossible to know really for sure. And I think people need to be better, not only at hiring, but also at knowing when to fire soon. So sometimes you hire, you think it's a good candidate, you figure out after very quickly, probably that it's not really the case. Either put into the contract that the first month is kind of a tryout period for both sides or whatever. People need to be better, I feel, at learning how to fire employees that are not a good fit, because hiring is just half of the deal.
Awesome.